Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pathways to the Cosmos. We're really excited to have on today's edition Christine Matsuda. My name is Kelly Blumenthal. I'm the director of the Office for Astronomy Outreach. And this is going to be a really interesting conversation. So me and Christine have been working together and kind of floating in the same circles for quite some time. And I consider her a great friend and really I admire her work quite a bit. So I'm really excited to have you on, Christine, so that we can have this really interesting conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I hope all of you will as well, and hopefully get more involved and learn more on your own about the work that Christine does. So I don't want to talk too much at the beginning. Christine, I want to give you the platform to really discuss the work that you do and let everyone know what it is that you talk about when you're talking about mutuality in astronomy.
Yeah, I would love to. And thank you so much for having me, Kelly. This is a really cool opportunity. First of all, to spend some time with you, who I adore, and also to have this conversation with more members of our sort of extended family of people who love astronomy and are deeply invested, hopefully, in the connection between our cultures, our intellectual curiosity about what is, in the universe beyond and how all of those things fit together in the human experience. And I always just have so much fun getting to spend time with you and talk about big ideas. So I'm really excited to be here. Um, well, you and I know each other, uh, gosh, years and years, right? I think the first time you and I interacted was because one of my very dearest friends, who is a good friend of yours, was in grad school with you. And so we've been through many phases of life together, many different kind of windy career paths. My windy career path started not in astronomy, but with a career and interest in actually like helping people understand each other better. And that led me along a route that started with nonprofit communications and fundraising into issues management and crisis communications, which then led me back into astronomy, which is a really interesting sort of like these things kind of tend to go in circles or maybe spirals. Because as a kid growing up in Hawaii, I was in the shadow of Maunakea, literally and figuratively. And my uncle, my dad's youngest brother, is the director of the W.M. Keck Observatory. And so this is like in my genetics. And I don't know if it's like irony or fate that astronomy has therefore ended up being such a huge part of my professional identity and my career, even though I am the world's farthest thing from an astrophysicist, or, even honestly, like a hobby astronomer. My interest in astronomy is in the people and in the ways in which our astronomical institutions interact with the communities that we're a part of and the capacity that we have to inspire and spark curiosity and to educate and to open doors, interesting, imaginative doors for people in careers and just, in their own pursuit of their own things that they're interested and curious about. So a little bit about the work that I do in this space. We have in here in Hawaii, on Maunakea, experienced a huge amount of change in the last 15 years. Um, the roots, the seeds of that huge shift have been in the ground for a long time in this place. And I don't want to give the impression or misimpression that all of a sudden something dramatic happened that nobody understood or could have foreseen. That's not the case. But as many of your audience might be aware, in 2015 and then with growing momentum all the way into 2019, there was a huge stand, a very powerful stand of Native Hawaiian activists and allies on Mauna Kea in opposition to the development of the 30-meter telescope. And that was a huge wake-up call for people who had been, intentionally or unintentionally ignoring the fact that there was a really unhealthy set of relationships between astronomical institutions in my home in Hawaii and the community that they're situated within. And so I got involved because of that tension. That's when I kind of entered into the astronomy sphere with this essential question of how do we work together, the big we community, of which I am a part, to mend the tears that this kind of conflict had inflicted in our community and find a different path forward. What does that look like? What do we have to do? What are the steps that we take? And how do we keep that momentum up? Because this is generational work. And as I have had the opportunity to serve in that capacity here in Hawaii, we've realized that we may have been like the leading indicator of crisis here in Hawaii on Maunakea, but that it is a condition that exists almost, I don't want to say everywhere, but certainly a lot of places where scientists have built large telescopes around the world. Because, you know, it's become a little bit of a trope at this point, but it's kind of true, right? Like all land is indigenous land, whether the indigenous people still live there or not. And by definition, almost, where we site large telescopes, where we're looking for good seeing and in these amazing pristine conditions, tend to be on places where other things have not been developed for reasons that are people based, right? Either they're so remote or they're inhospitable for whatever reason. And in the case of places like Mauna Kea, they haven't been developed because they're sacred to people. And those things are all interconnected, right? Like the remoteness and the specialness of a place often has something to do with why a group of people would hold that place in high esteem, whether it's from a spiritual perspective or a cultural perspective or a scientific perspective. We all, you know, have these different lenses with which we view these special places. And what we have in common is that we understand them to be special. And the question is who is empowered to therefore decide what's the appropriate use for these special places. And you know what I've learned and the sort of way that this work that I do has expanded into national and international spaces is in that asking the bigger question of like, well, what is that power dynamic? Who has the governance authority to make those decisions? Is that just and equitable? And does it not only account for, but ideally, right, center the needs, ideals, interests, and aspirations of the communities in which these institutions become situated?
There's so much embedded within everything that you just said. And I want to, you know, there's this really great, I think it's a PhD thesis that I read when I was in grad school that talks about I think it lists 3 different case studies of telescopes and the relationships that they have with the communities in which they're embedded. And that is a really interesting way to think about and kind of study the different ways in which astronomers and all of the, you know, the community around astronomy interact with the people that are there and that have been there for generations. And so what is the work that you do that kind of, you know, transcends just, you know, just working within the Hawaiian community? And, you know, it's and the way that it impacts those communities really. And you know, we've had such interesting conversations with Native Hawaiian people and Totem O'odham people and people from just many nations across Turtle Island. Many of you might not know what Turtle Island is, the North American roughly continent. But the ways in which these communities interact and the conversations that we've been having. And I wonder maybe if you could just talk about that a little bit. There's so many like kind of nuggets that I remember from those conversations that we've had in the past. You know, it was years ago, but it still is very present in my mind. And can you just maybe talk about that a little bit? I mean, I know that I don't want this to be too much of an interview, but there's so much that you have kind of embedded in what you're saying that I just want to kind of get it all out there, and then maybe we can talk about it a little bit more informally.
Yeah, totally. And I reserve the right to ask you questions right back, Kelly. So yeah, I mean, I guess a starting point to answer your question is with another story, which is that at a certain point, I went and like sought advice from some people who I really respect in our community here on Hawaii Island about like, all right, like we really gotta change the way that we're in relationship with community on behalf of the observatories, the astronomy institutions here on this island. And I had all of these ideas about things that I wanted to see happen and things that I wanted to facilitate. And without getting into depth on that, I went to these folks who I really respect, and I said, okay, what do you think about all my great ideas? And they basically said, look, you got to get your own house in order first before you can expect to be able to have any credibility in changing your relationship outside of the walls of these institutions. And there are a couple of like really wise things embedded in that piece of advice. One is that we were thinking then um, in error that there was an us and a them, when if you change that mindset, right, that like the people who work in these institutions, and we're talking about telescope institutions, right, observatories, people who are operating telescopes, but I think this is equally true for academic institutions too, universities and research labs and all of that. By coming to this place, you should be opting into being a part of that community. And certainly for the workforce that is born and raised in these communities that come and take jobs and have these really interesting, wonderful careers at observatories, they are of community, their family and friends, and they are the community, right? It's them. And so if we have unhealthy dynamics inside of our institutions, if we have a lack of awareness and understanding of what it means to be a part of a community, then we're not going to be able to do well by going out and saying like, hey, let's all be friends, if we cannot authentically have that sort of health of connectivity just within the people who are on payroll, right? Um, and so we took that idea and said, all right, well, what are we learning here in Hawaii? We've had a hard road and learned some really hard lessons. And in the spirit of get your own house in order, what might we do to help our colleagues in other places across the American continent and in international, community, astronomy community spaces as well? Like learn from our mistakes, allow us to be an example of what not to do, but also things that we have learned and turned the corner on and are doing really well now. And so we entered into these bigger settings, or I guess broader settings, if you will, of folks who are in collaboration. We're building sort of a community of practice around this with people who are in the same discussion, in the same tension and push and pull at different sites and in different kind of bodies of work all over the world, to say like, okay, well, like, what are you guys doing and how might we work together? And that's a really great program idea. I have this resource, or like, I've had a similar experience. Let me help you with that. We've been convening meetings at different, intervals and different spaces where folks who work in the astronomical professions come together already to talk about these issues and work together and to support each other in doing some of this really hard stuff that isn't always really well understood by our colleagues. And that's how the work has sort of expanded over time. And I'm really privileged to be in sort of a facilitator role in a lot of those spaces, which I just love. I really cherish that opportunity to be able to not just like myself get help from other people, but to create conditions where all of us are building on and learning from each other. And, you know, if anything, like the central organizing idea here is that astronomy is done by people and people need each other. And whether we're in the kind of work that I do, building relationships in community, or we're in the space of like putting together really badass teams who are going to make incredible discoveries, the human quotient of this, the ability for people to be in good, productive, healthy, supportive relationships with each other is like the baseline of what we need to do.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that has always like really stuck with me in one of the conversations that I had during one of those meetings that you convened was that we have to think about this not like a fruitcake. Like you're not embedding indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways of knowing indigenous people into an already existing community. It's more a mix. It has to be something that's interacting with itself. You know, you can't have individual little chunks that are just inserted. It needs to be more, not homogenous necessarily, but be more in relationship with each other, with yourself. Because, you know, ultimately you are all part of this community, just as you're saying, and you need each other to work together in order to make the whole system work. You know, I think Hawaii is a really brilliant example of how if you don't live in community with the people who are right there, then the whole system breaks down. And you can't move forward unless you come to some kind of agreement. You know, you don't necessarily have to have consensus, but you have to have healthy agreement about what is best for the entire community. And that's just so deeply important. And, you know, I think something that we try to kind of embody on like an international stage in the things that we do outreach. It's so important to see how different cultures and communication styles and people come together to really try to make this international community of astronomy communicators work. And it's very much very similar, I think, to at least the flavor of the work that you're doing. Maybe not the substance, but yeah, it's a really wonderful opportunity to be a part of this collaboration that you started.
Yeah, there's something so like rich and full of opportunity about the idea you're talking about, like not a fruitcake, but a mix. Um, you know, I was talking about this with some of our astronomy colleagues recently that like, you know, in Hawaii, there is I guess I think we call it a language, pidgin. You know, this happens all over the world, right? You've lots of different cultures that come and mix. And in our case in Hawaii, it was a result of the plantation era when there were Chinese, Portuguese, Japanese, Hawaiians, Filipinos who all came and lived side by side in plantations because of the sugar trade, the sugar industry. And then a new language develops, and it has the grammatical structure of Olelo Hawaii, right? Native Hawaiian language, and vocabulary words from all of those other languages. And I I think about like what my aspiration for the body of knowledge that we create
Mm,
in astronomy, almost like pigeon, with like all of those things that's so like wonderful and rich about the mixture of local culture that exists in Hawaii today, plus like astrophysics jargon, right? Like mixed into the language. And it's just like part of the air that we breathe and the sort of like ambient fertile soil that we get to grow within. Um, I think like I'm interested in what you think too, Kelly, about this question of like I think a traditional perspective that a lot of people have when they think about hard sciences in general, but like astronomy in particular, is that it's like white lab coats, devoid of culture, totally objective, only logic. And that seems so, well, to me, right, non-scientist, but like boring and sterile when there's this whole universe of things to be curious about. And like, I'm curious, what you think about this question of like how culture and science interconnect in fruitful ways for the purposes of advancing science too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really I love this analogy to pigeon and to language because language changes the way that you think. I'm very slowly learning Japanese, very, very slow. It was the office is based in Japan, and that even just like the change in grammatical structure is kind of not messing, but like changing the way that I conceive of certain things. And it's so interesting in how that happens. Um, and just by nature of science being an international enterprise and people all over the world speaking different languages, you have different perspectives that you're bringing into the science that you're doing. And ultimately, scientists, everybody, all humans, all beings on this earth, even the rocks probably have a lens through which they experience the world, the universe. And there's no way to extract that from the science that you're doing, the way that you're interpreting your data. One of the examples that I think of um, that I've been thinking a lot of recently is people with synesthesia. Um,
Mm,
People with, maybe they see sound. Um, so if they hear a certain piece of music, they have a certain visual experience, and no synesthetic experience is the same. So you have synesthetes who have they maybe they see like this blue, green, purple when they hear uh, Bach fugue, and the same Bach fugue makes somebody see orange and red and yellow, and there's no way that you can match those experiences, those subjective experiences, to make something objective, because it cannot be the same, because everybody's the internal structure of everybody's brain is ultimately different. And I think it's very much the same with analyzing data and understanding scientific data. There's all of these really interesting perspectives, all of your culture, your history, your background that you bring to the table when you're understanding your data. And even changing, the color scheme of your data can change the way that you interact with and you interpret your data. And we do this all the time in science. You're changing the color contrast, you're changing the color scheme that you're using. You're using something that's monotone. You're using something that's colored or strict rainbow, and that means that there cannot be any true objective. We talk about like the myth of objectivity, and I think that's I think that's really true. And the fact that there can be no objective truth means that we need to have all of these subjective experiences come together and approach some kind of agreement, a healthy agreement on what we understand and think to be true. And I say think to be true because there's no true way to know that what we're thinking about is true. And that's true of scientific data, and that's also true of people. And I think it's a very clear connection, at least for me, to see that um, the communities that we're trying to build and maybe repair, and bringing people together in a earnest, respectful, and meaningful way, and intentional way, is very much the same as the way that we approach science, the scientific process, because ultimately science is done by people, and you cannot extract the experience of people from the way that we do science.
It's so true. And there's so much opportunity there too. I'm really struck in the work that I do because I get to kind of float right in between the Nobel Prize winners and the high school students and the community members and the cultural practitioners and like be a part of so many different conversations. And the ones that I think are so fun are the ones where somebody who maybe doesn't think of themselves as a scientist finds out that there is a field of study that exists for the thing that they're curious about. Like, I love those conversations when they occur. And it's like these different perspectives and different pathways that lead people into just like coming at the same thing from these different vantage points that lead them to have curiosity that like points at exploration just in a different way so that you can understand whatever it is a little bit more fully. And like I can give you like all kinds of examples of this, but some of my favorite ones include um, I was in the room. I'm so privileged to be in so many of these really amazing spaces and these amazing moments. I was in the room at the time when two observatory directors brought the first EHT result to a cultural practitioner who we love and respect very much, Dr. Larry Kimura, who is an expert in Native Hawaiian traditional naming practices, and explained the science of the result that was going to be the first image of the black hole and what it showed, like what it demonstrated that they didn't understand or didn't expect, or like what was going to be really interesting about it to the public when the data was released, when the image was released. And um and Dr. Kimura took that in and really thought about it. And then the name that he eventually offered, Povehi, in his explanation of what the name means, articulated the scientific phenomenon in a way that struck the observatory directors as a more elegant um, and clear articulation of the phenomenon than they could pull off in the entirety of their very, very long academic paper. That was a really amazing thing. And another like thing that just happens all the time, our mutual friend Mary Beth Lechek, who is the program director for this wonderful program called Maunakea Scholars. This program offers telescope time, usually the director's discretionary time from each of our major observatories to local high school kids, um, based on their proposals that they put together with Mary Beth and the mentors that she works with. All the time, they have these kids who are just like totally unbothered by expectations of what they should or should not be able to do. And they come out with these brilliant, super creative proposals for their research. And oftentimes, Mary Beth will tell us, like, oh, yeah, this was a really hard one because the proposal is not that it was dumb, it was too sophisticated for what we would be able to pull off. But it's like without really going through the many, many years of education, right? These kids are thinking about things that are at the very leading edge of what's possible with our scientific technology right now and are like, well, I'm curious, I want to know. And how they got there is different than, our PhD postdocs who are asking questions about the same things, but from a different angle. But the curiosity is there. And we're coming at these questions from these different angles in just really, really fascinating ways. I got one more story, which is also one of my favorite favorites, which is also about Dr. Larry Kimura and one of our other mutual friends and colleagues, Doug Simons. The two of them have been in now, I think, almost a decade-long conversation about the alignment in description of the physical and scientific and spiritual phenomena of the Big Bang. And so Dr. Simons coming to this from the perspective of an astrophysicist, and Dr. Kimura as a cultural practitioner who has translated the Hawaiian origin chant, the Kumulipo, which describe the same thing. And the delight that both of them have, and that we as friends and audience members of theirs have in that interchange of ideas, and how much each learns from the other about how they can think about the things that they know and are the leading experts in, but how they can inform each other to think about them differently and deepen their own understanding of the thing that they're the expert in, is just the most amazing thing to me. And like that's where I find a lot of hope and inspiration in how we might just like think differently about who gets to be a scientist and who participates in this endeavor of astronomical inquiry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's the power of astronomy, is that it's so transversal in the way that you can approach it. You know, it's not just coming at it from math and science and technology, but it's so deeply embedded into the way that people live their lives, and the kind of deep connection that I think everybody has. You know, when you look up at the night sky, if you were privileged enough to live in a place where you can look up at the night sky and see more than like Orion, which is where I grew up, um, then you can have this experience and feeling of awe and wonder, and it changes your mindset, changes the way that you think, and you can approach that from poetry, from language, from art, and it's just so much more accessible, I think, than any other science. I mean, that's why we call it a gateway science. It just kind of leads you, you know, you start getting curious about astronomy, and then, you know, next thing you know, you're studying biology and thinking about tardigrades and Europa or something like that. And it's a really exciting opportunity. And even if you don't wind up working in science or studying science, it still sits with you and, you know, gives you the tools that you need to be a better citizen, be a more informed, you know, person in society. And I think that's something maybe that we desperately need. But um, you know, talking about Maunakea scholars, I have a deep love for this program, as you know, not only because, you know, the way that Mary Beth has been running this program since, I guess, for the last 10 years now, is just, you know, the interactions and the relationships she has with the teachers and the students is just so, you know, beautiful and genuine. But the the projects that the kids come up with are so, like you're saying, they're so sophisticated. It's like they're coming up with a PhD thesis. And you know, the kids that I worked with, they had amazing ideas, and I couldn't believe that they, you know, they read like a couple articles or something, or even, you know, just said like, I've heard about this thing, and I'm really interested in learning more. And I think that I have an understanding of a way to kind of approach solving that problem. And it's so interesting to see their perspectives. And I think when I think about this, I think about a recent art exhibition that I went to of Aboriginal women from Australia. And there was this one artist who came to art kind of later in life, or came to expressing herself through painting later in life. And she had no knowledge of or formal training in Western art. So everything that she was creating was completely from her own experience and background and knowledge. And I thought, you know, I think that's so interesting and profound to approach art and to approach science really from a perspective that, you know, I think maybe the kind of traditional Western scientist would think maybe isn't appropriate to be approaching science or whatever field you're talking about. But there's so much value in the perspective that you have when you are coming to it from such a unique perspective. You're talking about your own subjective experience. That's truly, precisely what it is. It's your experience that's been almost untouched by external factors that gives you a kind of insight that I think a lot of Western scientists just can't have because they've been so influenced by these perspectives of what's come before. It's really hard to see or to question what has been done. And actually, I just was talking to my dad an hour ago, and he was telling me a story about a patient that was in the hospital who came into the hospital with stomach pain. He was seen by 3 doctors who all said, no, this is nothing. And then the 4th doctor independently looked at the results of all of the tests that had been done and said, I actually think it's this. And it wound up being, this particular issue, and it saved his life. And it takes a lot to not ignore, but to critically think about the evidence and the data that you have in front of you, and to say, you know what, no, I don't think that the people who came before me were correct. I'm going to go in a different direction. And maybe they're going to think that I, am exaggerating or I don't know what I'm talking about. But, sometimes that's true. But also sometimes you really change things. You change the paradigm and you move the entire field forward. And sometimes you save somebody's life. So it's a really interesting thing to see all of these perspectives and people coming together.
Yeah, it really is. And, I think it's funny that you mentioned your dad because I was just thinking like, oh, there's a generational like component to what we're talking about here too.
Absolutely.
That I'm like about to say a very millennial thing, I think, which is that there's something so important that about showing up as your full self, not just because like it's, mentally and emotionally healthier for people to not have to wall off certain parts of their identity or personality in order to be accepted in their place of work or, their social structure or whatever it is, but also just like you're better, right? You're more creative and more informed and more courageous in all of the ways that you just described in the example with the doctors. If you're willing to say, no, my experience is different than your experience, and that gives me an opportunity to see something that maybe you don't see, which
Mm-hmm.
improves the medicine, improves the science, improves the intellectual kind of like playing field of what's possible if we're all bringing something different to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's been like really important for me personally in the work that like I do and how I mentor my colleagues that I work with every single day. And like, the importance of showing up as our full selves and not feeling like we have to not be mothers or caregivers or, you know, people who have human needs, whatever variety. Like, we're not in my own workplace trying to show up like work robots. And to like go back to the beginning of the conversation, part of what we're trying to do in these spaces where we're like creating this community of practice and trying to open up the aperture, so to speak, for people to see things a little bit differently about why this work matters in academic institutions, scientific institutions, is like it's not just that being our full selves is better for the individual, it's also
Mm-hmm.
better for the pursuit of the science. And being open in that way, healthy in that way, is really something I deeply believe in.
Yeah. Yeah. And being open to seeing science in a different way, um, and not being kind of constrained by, again, what came before and the kind of tradition um, of tradition of Western science and tradition of the way that we think about things, and to kind of allow yourself the ability to see things through different perspectives. There's a really brilliant piece of work that I read a little while ago about the concept of two-eyed seeing, where you approach problems and perspectives and questions with multiple perspectives. And you don't just focus on the Western perspective or what's considered, the baseline. You bring to it with you perspectives from Indigenous communities, from communities that might not have been at the forefront of what people consider to be right or correct or anything like that. And it's I think a really beautiful way to approach not only science but also community, in the way that you're building relationship with people, and ultimately those relationships are what you need to move through anything, to move through conflict, to move through good times. Even, it's not just in conflict that you need this kind of community. It is it's deeply important for really any phase of this process where we're kind of moving together. And in order to move forward, we need to move together.
Yeah, the two-eyed seeing thing. In Hawaii, we say makawalu, which is 8 eyes. And it's that same idea of being able to see something, approach something with multiple perspectives and look at those, in that case, 8 lenses at what it is you're seeing to be able to really understand it. Which I'm going to use as a pivot to one of the themes that we were talking about earlier. I just kind of like mentioned it, but I want to bring it back. The theme of power.
Mm.
And that's something that I think a lot of people, maybe that's not a lens that they use when we're thinking about science and about academic institutions. But it's one I think about all the time because it's
Mm.
really like a central organizing theme for me to understand how we got to where we are in places of conflict around observatories and where they're sited and how they're built and how they work and all of that. And so where I'm going with this is that we have in the field of astronomy, maybe because it's so kind of universally loved, right? It like has been invested in by governments to and large institutions, huge philanthropists, and by virtue of having so much resource, the field has a lot of power.
Mm.
And um, and so if we can see through that particular set of eyes what those power dynamics look like, um, it also helps us to think a little bit more about and perhaps differently about how those institutions and the people who run them and work in them um, should view their interactions with the community members that they are living with and alongside. Because I think scientists don't always think about themselves as being very powerful,
Mm.
but in the dynamics of like, the town that I live in, there's a very real power dynamic with these institutions and how much power they exert over decision making and have historically exerted over decision making on all kinds of things, political, land use, governance, what have you. So I think what I'm getting ready to do, Kelly, is actually ask you a question about like the role that astronomy institutions around the world from your vantage point at the IAU could be thinking about that power that we
Mm.
have and what how it can be applied in a way that is community centered when we're thinking about like the Office of Astronomy Development, for example, and like the objectives you guys have through that area of work. And then like for those of us who are working at a more local level, how we interface with that and
Mm.
advance those objectives together.
Yeah, oh gosh, this is such a can of worms. So I and thank you for bringing this up. I think, I um I noticed this a lot when I was living in Hawaii, that just what you're saying, that astronomers don't think that they have a lot of power. But I think that this washing of responsibility is largely because many astronomers consider themselves to be, kind of like angels pursuing truth. And in that pursuit of truth, like capital T truth, which does not exist, they are immune to the evils of power, and don't see themselves as yielding that kind of power. And I think, a big part of this is demonstrating to people that that's not true, and that they do have this responsibility to take the power that they yield, the power that they have, and to use it to benefit the communities in which they live, the society in which they live, and the people with whom they live amongst. And so, I think there's this really interesting interaction that can happen between, all of the offices at the IAU. We have there's 4 offices for the IAU. There's the Office for Astronomy Outreach, that's us. There's the Office of Astronomy for Development, Office of Astronomy for Education, and Office of Young Astronomers. And there's a reason why the IAU created these 4 offices and intentionally wanted them to all exist. There's a lot of overlap between the 3. The Venn diagram is very nearly a circle, but there's a lot of interesting ways that the offices can work off of each other to build this kind of ecosystem of taking power, yielding it, and redistributing it to produce educational systems, policy systems that work together to benefit society, and not just benefit part of society. But that takes a lot of intentional effort. It takes people understanding what power means and how it can be used, which is difficult. I think that might be more difficult than making these political systems in the first place. But things that the offices can do. You have the Office of Astronomy for Development can move the needle on policymaking and make it easier for institutions and national foundations to build programs that build educational systems, for example, that then the Office of Astronomy for Education work within educational systems to improve astronomy curricula, which, as we were talking about before, kind of changes the way that you think about the world, the way that you critically analyze information that's coming into you, or coming towards you, I suppose, and changes the way that we kind of perceive and interact with the world. And that none of that can happen if you don't have people who are engaging the public and engaging policymakers, engaging teachers and students with the science, to get people excited and to let people know and to bring them into this space where they see astronomy as something that they can be a part of, and that they can bring all of their different perspectives into. And then, once you have this entire, it's not a pipeline. It's kind of like what you were saying. It's like a spiral at the very beginning. And then this all kind of leads into, what can you do with all of that? Who can you benefit? And then the Office of Young Astronomers is really about capacity building and creating educational opportunities for master's and PhD students in places where they often don't have, they want to pursue a master's degree or PhD in astronomy, but maybe they don't have that many astronomy courses. They can't learn the things that they want to learn, and so they go to the International School for Young Astronomers and they learn these things. They have the ability to improve. It's really all about capacity building, about improving human capital, and that's such a deeply important thing for the astronomical enterprise. but it all feeds back into itself. And that, I think, ultimately is, this kind of use of power and this redistribution of power. But it does require that you have people at every level who are on board with the same thing that you're on board with. And that is difficult. That's a challenge.
That's a good callback to the earlier theme of we got to get our own house in order.
It is.
Finding that alignment amongst ourselves in institutions and in the field so that we have a sort of common understanding of what we got to go do. And some of it is really hard.
Yeah.
And so I'm very privileged to kind of be in a space where I get to help be a catalyst for that. I feel
Yeah.
really grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah. And I really do too, from from the OAO perspective. I think there's a lot that we can do in influencing and maybe encouraging um, institutions to think of education and public engagement as part and parcel of the scientific process. It's not something that you add to science. It's something that is science. Your science is not complete until you have communicated it. And even then, it is a spiral. It is ongoing, perpetually. You can never know one thing for certain, and you always must be communicating this. And you have to communicate every part of it. It's not just the result, but it's the process. It's the uncertainty. It's the failure, and this whole process is necessary to communicate and to get institutions to feel that that is true, that that is something that they need to have to be part of, um, is in itself a challenge. But that's also, the I think the role that we have as an international office that's dedicated to public engagement, is to try and bring these institutions into the fray, to get our house in order, and to try to bring people all into the same page.
Oh, can I tell you about one of my new favorite projects that we're working on? I mean, I
Yes,
guess it's not that new, but it is definitely a favorite.
please do.
Uh, for the Maunakea observatories, a couple of years ago, we totally redid their digital presence. And my team, I'm going to shout out one of my amazing team members, Olivia Cropper, who is leading the charge for us at Paʻakai Communications. It's the name of our team. To organize a really robust storytelling effort that we're doing with the observatories and our colleagues across all of those institutions. And the idea is, if you look at maunakeaobservatories.org and you click on stories, you're not going to find science papers. You're going to find the story behind the science papers, the story behind these amazing things that take place at the observatories, because we want to tell stories not about just the data, but the people. And we're having so much fun with this. So the experience that hopefully folks will have if they go and read these stories is we want it to be like spending time with your really good friend, maybe over a beer, talking about their work and their colleagues and how these incredible things, these incredible achievements occur. What was it like to be in that collaboration? How did they have the idea to, solve that particular technological engineering problem in order to make the instrument work the way it was supposed to work? And then this beautiful discovery took place. Who are the people who get behind and organize the events that take place in community, and how do they happen so that we can create these moments of inspiration and opportunity for local kids? It's the story of the people that make the science happen, and it's been so fun to get those stories going. And we have a ton of new ideas in the pipeline right now that we're working on, and I'm just really excited to keep doing that storytelling.
I love that. I love that so much. And humanizing science is such a deeply important thing. I think it makes it easier for people to see themselves in that role. And really the reason why we started doing these live streams, the Pathways of the Cosmos, is to humanize astronomy engagement and the different ways that people come together to do astronomy, in the hopes that, you know, it'll spark something within someone. And it's such a important work. And I think that it's becoming more and more common, to think about these things and to think about, you know, not just the astronomers, but also the engineers and the technicians that work on these telescopes, that work on, you know, even, you know, at the visitor center, the people who do the public observing nights. All of that is so important, to how the whole system functions. And to tell those stories is just, it's just wonderful. It's wonderful to read, it's wonderful to see, and it's wonderful to, you know, give to a kid, say, this is something that you could do. You could see yourself in that. So I think maybe that's a good place to leave this up. I like this idea that we're all just human, and we are humans trying to be in community with other humans and do science, do amazing things, do art. But in the end, we're all just people trying to come together. So, Christine, with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for being here with us today on Pathways to the Cosmos.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure, Kelly. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's always so wonderful to spend time with you. Thanks for having me.